Hey, Mike Rain here with Canadian Musician right now in downtown Toronto with one of the, well, I guess being hailed as one of Quebec's most promising emerging singer-songwriters, Matt Holubowski. Matt's had a very interesting career and kind of breakout in recent years that we'll get into. But Matt, first of all, thanks for making the trip to Toronto. How's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
And so your sophomore album, Solitudes, is now out. We'll get into kind of the making, writing of the album and that. But first, I just kind of want to go through a bit of background with you. Folks in Quebec, particularly Francophone Quebec, will be very familiar with you already because of quite a famous show that you're a finalist in. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the French word. I'm horribly anglophone, but it's essentially the French-Canadian version of The Voice. Although, do you want to give the French word?
Well, maybe you can give it a try. It's La Voix.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I was like, my French pronunciation is horrible. But you were a finalist on La Voix after you'd be recruited sort of to appear on that show after your first album had come out. Before we get into the experience of the show, what it's done for you, particularly in Quebec, where was your career at that point? Like before appearing on the show, your first album was out, but I've seen you say it didn't do what you were expecting or didn't do much. So where were you at prior to the show?
I think the idea of a career hadn't really popped into my head at that point, and it wasn't so much that I had no expectations putting out the first record. It was more of one of those bucket list things. You know, I'd finished university and I was sort of meandering about the world, traveling for a little while, and I had this kind of epiphany while I'd gotten a job somewhere in Taiwan teaching English, and I realized I was 24 I think at the time, and I wanted to come home and make a record, just to make a record, give it a shot for a year. And so, that's what I did. I made Old Man. That was the first record, and self-produced and everything. And then like you said, I got recruited by this TV show at a point where I was like still unsure as to whether music was a career that I wanted to undertake. It was between teaching and music, and I felt teaching was probably a safer bet. And in the end, I got recruited, and I wasn't very interested or familiar really with the concept of The Voice, and it wasn't something that really appealed to me, or necessarily, my style of music doesn't necessarily appeal to the audience of that kind of show. I thought at that point, and in the end, after getting badgered a few times, I decided to give it a shot just for fun, and it turned out to be a really cool experience.
We were talking actually before we started recording here. Your father's a Polish immigrant to Quebec. Your mother, I believe, is she French Canadian? Yeah. Your mother? Yeah. Did you grow up in a musical family? Like, what at 24 made you say, I'm going to give music a shot, at least in some way?
Not really. Yeah, it's interesting. My sister played piano and violin for a very long time. She was actually the musician in the household for a long time. My parents didn't play any instruments. My dad, enjoys a lot of music, so I got a lot of my classics education from my dad. And I guess I just kind of developed, the taste for playing guitar kind of late-ish, around 17, 18. And I just kept doing it, and the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it. Obviously, the more you do it, the better you get, the more interesting it becomes. And then I started doing, little open mics and bar gigs and things like that. And, you start doing that kind of thing, the crowd gets slightly bigger. You go from 1 to 4 people at your shows, and then to 10 and then 20, and you start getting a taste for like, oh, maybe I can do this for real, So, yeah, but then again, it would just kind of happen. So it wasn't, there was no motivation at the beginning to do this as a career, that not in the same way that when I saw the exposure that I got through this TV show, things started working and started selling records, people showing up to the shows, so it motivated me to sort of impregnate myself within the artistic community.
You'd said, and I've seen you say previously, you were hesitant to appear on La Voix. They had reached out to you, I believe through SoundCloud. They had discovered your first album on there.
Yeah.
Bandcamp. Okay. They discovered your first album through Bandcamp, and they had reached out to you, which I think my assumption is in most of these scenarios is people, auditioning, applying to be on the show. I didn't know producers will actually reach out. Maybe it's something that's unique to La Voix, but you said when they did, you were hesitant at first because of the, I guess, preconceptions that people have about, music-based shows of that sort. What was in your head, and what essentially convinced you to say, what, maybe this is worth it?
It was just kind of for kicks, really. At the beginning, I didn't really take it as seriously as I should have, maybe at the beginning, in the sense that I kind of went in and I figured. Actually, I'd spoken to some of my Anglophone friends about it, and they didn't know the show either, and so I'm bilingual, but sort of live within the more Anglophone realm of culture. And but then my Francophone friends were telling me, "You're absolutely insane! Like, you have to do this. You don't understand. Like, half the province literally watches the show every Sunday, and it doesn't matter if whatever you don't agree with the way the mise en scène, the way that the setup and the decor and the concept. Just go do your thing and then see what happens. If worst case you have nothing to lose, you lose, and that's it." And, you don't want to go and make an ass of yourself in front of 3 million people either. So you have to be relatively confident that you'll do all right. But, I guess the deciding factor was, I've always loved adventure and I love trying new things. And I'd never been on a TV set before. So it was really something of like, I could learn something from this experience. And also, the whole idea, like you said, people have preconceived ideas of what these things are, and as did I, at that point. And I try to be open-minded about these things, and I said, let's go see for ourselves rather than just, bastardize the whole idea. Yeah. You go see for yourself and figure out if it's really what you thought it was.
And there's going to be compromises and just any kind of thing like that, but musically, it seems like you were determined to say, I'm going to go do this, I'm going to take advantage of it, but I'm not going to change who I am musically. And maybe you were a bit surprised that they were even actively reaching out to a singer-songwriter such as you.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it was surprising that they would, veer towards that style of folk music. Quebec is very into its folklore generally, and folk music is very popular, but I guess like the stuff I do diverges a little bit to the left. Still folk really at its essence. So yeah, I mean, I didn't think it was going to go beyond the first step of the whole thing, and it turned out that more people enjoy that kind of music than I thought.
It made you fairly quickly. It kind of turned you into a household name at least within the Francophone segment of Quebec. And you said it's interesting that prior to this, you didn't even know what the show was, whereas all your Francophone friends are saying, "Man, the show's massive. You got to do it." It's interesting, and I know the name of your new album, Solitudes, is taken from the classic Ian McLennan novel, Twin Solitudes, I believe it's called. And within the novel, the solitudes he's referring to is, Anglophone and Francophone Canada. It seems like you're almost a prime example of experiencing those two solitudes and now trying to bridge the two. I guess I just want your perspective on that, as far as how is it possible that within the same province, within literally blocks of each other, sometimes there's these two completely separate cultures going on.
I wish I had the answer to that question. I think we've been rattling our brains about that since Hugh McLennan, really, and it's this dichotomy that just exists. I think really it's deeply ingrained in our culture, and maybe it has something to do with the split of media as well. Everything is kind of split, the music. But what's interesting about the music scene in Montreal, especially, is that there is actually much more collaboration than people realize behind the scenes, and that comes from especially musicians, maybe not the singers themselves, but musicians who swap one another. So you have musicians from Plants and Animals performing with or producing records of French people, and then vice versa, Francophone musicians playing in English bands, and I think that that's an interesting place to start. But as to why this is the way it is, I don't know. I guess just people are stubborn. But I think less and less. I really think that, the way that music and media is propagated now, I think there's much more open-mindedness. And within the French music scene, you see also there's like a modernity that sort of has come about in the last decade or so, and for me as an Anglophone, it makes it more interesting to want to listen to francophone music, because a lot of anglophones, let's be honest, we snub it, and for reasons that I guess maybe we just don't identify. We have a more like Americanized British sound, and now the French world is starting to dig into that. So
I think there's maybe almost a sense of English Canada's able to snub it because we're in a position of kind of cultural dominance. There's a privilege that allows us to snub it that maybe people are only kind of identifying or becoming more aware of.
I sort of agree and disagree with that, because I think that the whole cultural dominance is a reality maybe here in Toronto, but in Quebec it's not. French dominates culture in Quebec generally, and it's made very obvious by the amount of media that focuses its attention on local artists. Whereas, let's say you're based out of Toronto, you're an indie anglophone, folk artist, based out of Toronto, and you want to get some sort of exposure. Well, you're competing with The Weeknd and Drake and all these big name artists. Whereas in Quebec, it's a smaller pool, so it's a really fascinating place to be in, and people really care about culture, and it's very important to support local arts. So I think it's a super positive actually thing that's going on in Quebec. So the cultural dominance thing, I think, only works outside of the Quebec borders. Yeah.
I guess what I meant was, like, if you're Anglophone, even in Quebec, it's just easier for you to access, I guess, English content than maybe if you're a Francophone in Quebec. You're more limited in the content that you have accessible to you.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But it's interesting. Just to go back to the name of the album for a second, Solitudes. I was recently, or I guess it was probably a couple months ago now, interviewed Leif Fullback. Not sure if you know Leif, but yeah, I figured you would. And another, obviously Anglophone but Montreal-based singer-songwriter, who I'd say you probably share some similarities with stylistically. And his recent album is called Two Solitudes. And again, I thought that novel was Twin Solitudes, and the album is Two Solitudes. Okay.
The album is Twin Solitudes.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. So Leif named his album Twin Solitudes, again, inspired by the same Ian McLennan novel. Maybe I'm kind of grasping at straws here, but I wonder if there's anything beyond coincidence, even if it's obviously not planned, but if there's any reason the two of you stylistically share a background, would be kind of finding that same inspiration at the same time.
I mean, it's possible. I was under the impression that Twin Solitude wasn't about that, but since I guess you spoke with him, you might.
The content of the album, not so much, but he did. But the album name is
interesting. I don't know the guy personally. Twin Solitude is currently my favorite record. It's an amazing record. I guess I don't know to what degree he's Francophone. I guess he is. He's from Montreal.
Yeah, he's Anglophone though.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So maybe he might have lived like a similar but different experience to what I did, because you have actually, I think, what I've narrowed it down to, I called the record Solitudes is because I think Hugh McLennan nailed the two Solitudes, the French and the English, but he omitted the one that has become more and more omnipresent, and that's the one that I live in. It's this third Solitude where you are equally Francophone and bilingual, and you exist in both realms and in neither at the same time. So it creates this sort of, anyway, in my case, like this crazy identity crisis where am I Francophone? Am I Anglophone? When I'm with Francophone people, I'm Francophone and I don't have an accent, and when I'm an Anglophone, I don't have an accent either. So I guess that would be, Leif and I might have a shared experience in that we live within this conflicting reality, but I think we also have a very different, he's probably like NDG west of Montreal, kind of that area, and I'm more Rosemont and so.
It's interesting. When I was talking to Leif, he said something very similar to you, whereas behind the scenes, on the musician level, that there is a lot more cross-pollination going on these days between the French and English music communities in Montreal. But just to return to the songwriting of Solitudes, first of all, time-wise, were these songs completely written post La Voix, or were you writing, some of these songs date back to before or during the show?
It's interesting to use La Voix as like a barometer, because like it had no impact on creation whatsoever. Okay, yeah. It had impact on visibility, but on creation, doesn't come from, I'm not gonna, do an interview with the Toronto Star and then go write a tune about it. So it was, I guess, Old Man was prior to the show, and then Solitudes. Most of the tunes, I guess, were written afterwards or during, or some of them were older. So
I guess where I was going with that is just I was interested time-wise because you're not going to write about the show or something like that, obviously. You're just life-wise in a different situation now than you would have been prior, obviously. I guess during the writing for this then, I guess did you feel any added pressure in the sense that when you're writing the songs for Old Man, like anyone on a debut album, you're writing for yourself, and you're not expecting, maybe you're not expecting, you're certainly not writing with a known audience in mind per se. Whereas this time around, people are going to be hearing these songs. That people are curious to hear the music that you're going to release. Is that in your head at all when you're writing it?
No, I don't think so. I see what you mean. I think the pressure is definitely much bigger when you have an audience. But you can't, if you start writing tunes because of what you think people are going to like or dislike, then you're not going to write very nice tunes. So the process for writing Solitudes was the same as Old Man, really, in that I just took from my experiences and from everything that I sort of pull in from my everyday life, and that's that. So I think I just tried to block that entire thought process out. It doesn't make sense to think that way, I don't think.
If you say you're pulling in, like any songwriter does that, you're pulling in those experiences, observations, feelings from everyday life, it would still be indirectly relate. Like, again, you're not going to write about the show, but your life is going to be different, with that added attention. So I guess specifically on this album, like, what did you find that there was a common theme in your life, whether it's a feeling, an experience, anything that was kind of coming up in that regard?
You mean with regards to
like no, well, just lyrically on this album. Oftentimes it's either conscious or unconscious, and you're going through the album in post production or during the mastering phase or something like that, and maybe then something pops out to you. It's like maybe there is something there that I was subconsciously had on my mind. Anything like that for you?
No, I think the process for me for writing a tune is I sort of have an idea that I sort of come up with at some point, some very broad concept or idea or story or something of that sort that I sort of I think about, and then I let it brew for some time, and I think about it and I read about it and I watch movies about it and I try to live that idea for sometimes a couple days, sometimes a couple months, and in some cases a few years, and then at some point there's that sort of that moment, I guess, that every musician will get, where they just get this first the first sentence, and then just kind of go through it. I don't know whether there's probably, if I went back and read all the lyrics again, I'd probably say like, oh, maybe I meant to say this and so on. But I'm pretty self-aware of what I'm writing, about in the moment. I know specifically what it's about. I can dissect the record line by line and tell you why I wrote that. So.
You're 28 now. You said you were 24 when Old Man came out. I'd say it's all relative, almost like when talking to athletes. When you say, like, oh, 29, you're a veteran. Of course, there's most people, 29 is still very young. But, like, in terms of having kind of like a breakout album, starting to gain, you were saying even this morning you went and spoke to Indie 88, the Toronto Star, the CTV, CBC. You're doing all this stuff now that this attention's coming on to you at this age, which, by breakout, musician standards is maybe, a few years older than average. Do you think you would have been a different artist had this happened? Are you, in some ways, are you glad it's happening at this age than if it happened when you were 23, 24? Do you think there's an advantage to that?
Yeah, totally. I don't think at 23, 24 I was ready for all this. I don't think I'd matured in enough in terms of my writing, my performing, this kind of discussion that we're having. I think that this whole explosion has given me also the opportunity to get a lot more stage time, so I'm able to sort of perform much more, and I think the more experience you have, the better. And I think it's one of those situations where I might have taken another road, and then I would never have gotten, I maybe would never have developed, some of the skills that I'm developing musically, and I sort of used the last couple of years to do that. So it's not over yet. I mean, yeah.
I know. Well, I believe that you're pretty close with like Patrick Watson and guys from Quebec and guys who have kind of gone through this kind of buzz artist stage of their career. Do you draw on them for perspective in any way?
Yeah, totally. I mean, some of the guys in the band that I perform with, like you say, Simon Angel, who played with Patrick Watson for a number of years, and Stéphane Bergeron, who played with Carquois throughout its entire life, and these guys have been through all the hoops. They've done the interviews, they've done the showcases, they've done the crappy gigs, they've done the great gigs, and they've done everything in between. They've traveled. They've experienced what it's like to sign a record deal and have an agent and all of these things that are a part of the artist's life. And so whenever I have concerns or questions, it's great to have those guys around to be able to say, hey, did this happen to you? How do you deal with that? And what's the best outcome I can expect or whatnot? And also because the industry is not that big in the sense that everybody kind of knows one another in some way or another. It's nice because those guys, they already know. I can say like, oh, Ben from the Toronto Star and Simon's buddy, of his. So it creates this intimacy that's really nice. So it's cool to be able to have those guys in my corner. Yeah.
I guess career-wise, moving forward, I speak to many musicians, whether it's something like Voix, or it's it could be they've won a contest, or there's some kind of event that kind of put them on the map, and you want to take full advantage of that. So you want to acknowledge it, pay respect to it, but you also pretty quickly want to move beyond that. You don't want to be, hey, that's the person from that show or the person from that competition, that kind of thing. For you and the team around you, the folks at Audiogram as well, are you kind of conceptualizing that stage of it as like, how do we move beyond just, to being Matt Holubowski, the great singer-songwriter, to being Matt Holubowski, the great singer-songwriter who was on that show. Know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as people want to talk about it, it's going to exist. I don't think it's something that I can shed completely. I think musically and artistically, I've already done that. I did that a while ago. The only thing that keeps me tagged to the concept is media, honestly.
And I know, like, I felt bad having like obviously at this stage you kind of have to ask about it, and then I feel bad harping on it and tried to kind of move beyond that, almost the mandatory questions about it in the sense. But you're right. It is, I say that it's almost it's kind of hypocritical to ask that as I've just asked about the show. But
it's an unavoidable topic. Especially like as I move, out west into the Anglophone realm, I sort of expect that people want it, because it's also fascinating. I mean, it's like, I think that it's super interesting, especially because I don't feel that I'm necessarily associated with that. And if we go beyond to Quebec, I don't talk about it anymore, and I just say like, sorry, like, been there, done that. We've already had this interview. Let's talk about something else. So, but crossing over the border into Toronto and elsewhere, it's unavoidable, and there's no shame in doing that. But definitely, it's there'll be a time where I'm just gonna say we're not gonna talk about that anymore. Yeah.
Fair enough. Now you're obviously kind of pushing into, like, you became a household name within Francophone Quebec, and we've talked obviously about the Solitudes, literally, but with interviews like this, the other interviews I mentioned, all English media, your songs are starting to get played on radio here in Ontario. Is there a concerted, I guess, blueprint for how you bridge that divide, how you go into kind of the more mainstream music, English media, and audiences, I should say?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's, the music is what it is, and if people want to listen to it, they're gonna pay attention to it, and if they have questions about it, I'm ready to answer it. Yeah. So, for the time being, I think the best strategy for us is to begin doing shows out here, opening acts, festivals, things like that. It's tough to get a whole band out, to do, unpaid gigs and things like that. So it costs money, but the strategy in our case is we do well in Quebec, so we're gonna kind of pile up, the funds there, and then spend it on coming out.
That's a smart strategy.
I think so, yeah. And but I mean, musically, it's just gonna keep going the way it's going, and we'll just see how people receive it.
And, well, like I said, new sophomore album by Matt Holubowski is called Solitudes, now out on Audiogram. I do really love the album, man. It's right up my alley, but I'm glad my friend Sil here's turned me on to it. I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that, it's as awesome as the Quebec market is, it's music that deserves to get out there and to be heard. And just congratulations on putting together a sweet collection of songs, man.
Thanks very much. Yeah, appreciate that.